Hello, dear ones. Today we have a slightly different video that is aimed at a different audience. Specifically, not at people who are affected by depression and are currently on the path to healing, but rather it is a video for the relatives, because the role of relatives in the healing process plays a huge role, much bigger than one might think. And that's why I've wanted to do this for a long time, to address those who spend most of the time with you in your close environment, who have the most influence on you, on your thinking, on your feelings, and on your life. That means primarily your partner or partners, your parents, your relatives, your, let's say, adult children. Small children are a completely different matter, but also friends, colleagues, bosses, and so on. So all the close people in your environment, for them this is important to become aware that they play a role in your healing journey, and what role they play. There are indeed a few things that relatives can do right, and there are also a few things they can do wrong. And for that very reason, I have once again compiled a list of 10, featuring the 10 biggest mistakes you can make as a relative of someone with depression. Welcome to Seelenklopfen. Today's video is directed at you as a relative of someone with depression. That means I kindly ask you to simply forward this video to those people it concerns. But perhaps it is interesting for everyone. Maybe it is also interesting for those affected just to hear, what is it actually like, the relationship with relatives? Why is it actually so important? So I have now compiled a list of 10 with the 10 biggest mistakes. And of course, we begin at the front with point 1. The biggest mistake you can make as a relative is to take on the role of the therapist. This is a very important principle that you keep reminding yourself of and keep it in mind. You are not the therapist of your depressed wife or husband. Please don't be surprised if I sometimes say therapist or I always mean both sides, and it's too exhausting for me with this gendering. So please don't be upset if I simply use the grammatically masculine form for simplicity's sake, as always. So, for you as a relative, it's important. It's not your job to treat, analyze, or give advice to the depressed person. And always all these things maintain equality. That is very important. You are two people meeting on equal terms. Especially in a partnership, it's important that such an imbalance doesn't develop, that one person isn't always the sick one, and the other is always the one who is the great one, the great hero who is doing well, who has no problems. Yes, that must not happen. You must not fall into such categories. And for that, it's very important that you as a relative are simply there, accompany, be there, listen, simply give the feeling that you are present. That's enough. So when the depressed person somehow complains about their suffering and says, and this is terrible, then usually the urge arises to help, to give tips, to solve the problem. Yes, but that's a misunderstanding. That's not your job, whether you are a partner or not, or friends or best friends or something like that. It's not your job to provide therapy to that person. There are professionals for that, and it's also important, even if you are a professional yourself, this applies to you still. Yes, that you stay in your role as a partner or as a friend or whatever. Yes, because otherwise these relationships shift to your disadvantage, and that's not good for your relationship. And otherwise the depressed person also feels somehow stupid. Before you were on equal footing, and suddenly they feel like this. Now I'm the silly little child who knows nothing and is overwhelmed with advice. That's not a nice feeling as a depressed person. So if the person is suffering, maybe sit down, put an arm around them, nod understandingly, be there to listen. That's enough. That's completely enough. Okay. Point 2 involves trying to rescue or lift the depressed person out of their state That's not your job, and it doesn't work, especially not in the long run. And the more often you try, the more you exhaust your own strength. Maybe you've already noticed it's a natural need. What then arises is the urge to lift them up because you can hardly bear to see this beloved person in such a state, in this hole, in this swamp. And you want it to stop. Totally understandable, but take care of your own strength. You can't save anyone, and it's not your job. It's not your responsibility. And this is very important, because if the depressed person wants to come out of it, they must take on their own learning task to regain self-efficacy. So you can't do it for them. You can't help them get back on their feet or say, I'll call there for you. Get help, I'll call there for you. Under no circumstances should you call any therapists. The depressed person must do that themselves. This is a very important experience they need to have, so they get the feeling that they can help themselves. That's the point. Depressed people often feel so helpless and have the feeling that they can't make any impact here in the world. And if you then go and say, I'll do it for you, you can't do it yet, then I understand. You reinforce their depressive pattern. That's why it's a mistake. The person must seek help themselves. They must be willing to try new things, to step out of their comfort zone. They must have the experience themselves. Only then do they have a chance at healing. Therefore, accompanying and being there is okay, but wanting to rescue or uplift them doesn't work. Okay. I don't mean that you should leave the person hanging. So let's say providing assistance in everyday life, something like taking over shopping or picking up the children, or everyday tasks that are just too much or too exhausting for the depressed person at the moment. Taking over those tasks is fine. It's just about the relevant things that are important for the healing process, like finding a therapist and such. The depressed person must do that on their own, absolutely. So don't take over their life. That's the most important thing. Point 3. The biggest mistake is trivializing problems. It might be that the problems of the depressed person seem completely insignificant to you, and you might think, my goodness, why are they making such a fuss? That can't be true. That's not a problem. That could be solved quite easily. Why don't they just do it? That's a very common reaction, a completely normal, natural, and understandable reaction from relatives. But still, this person wants to be taken seriously because for them, it's a real problem. If they can't motivate themselves to get up from the sofa, it might seem to you like, that's just something you do. No, for them, it's like running a marathon. You need to realize that. Please take this seriously. Take everything seriously. Of course, you don't have to exaggerate it and say, yes, it is really terrible and awful, and certainly not that, yes. So don't go to the opposite extreme by constantly emphasizing how exhausting it is to get up. No, of course not. It's just about the fact that the depressed person wants to be taken seriously in their subjective experience and suffering. And that also includes not using cliches, please. Things like, hey, it's not that bad, or it will get better, or negative comments like, don't make such a fuss. It's also common to hear things like that, or what many depressed people experience and suffer greatly from is when relatives or outsiders say things like, you're still laughing, so you can't be depressed. So when their depression is not believed because relatives have some cliched ideas, that depressed people just cry all day long. No, that's not the case, yes. They can still laugh. Or because there are two reasons for this. One could be that they put on a mask. Most depressed people do this because they don't want anyone to see that they are depressed. That's why they laugh even more, so that people think everything is fine. That's one possibility. And the other thing is also something you should always keep in mind. This person is not solely defined by their depression. Rather, every person, no matter how mentally ill, also has healthy parts. And it's very important that these can always come to the forefront, that their happy, laughing side, which the person has, is allowed to emerge again and again, And you can also reinforce and engage with that and be happy that their laughing side is coming to the surface and is still there. So don't take it as an opportunity to say you're not depressed at all. It hurts a lot when someone says something like that because you simply feel like you're not being taken seriously. And to recognize something like this, it's important for you as a relative. It's very, very important that you thoroughly inform yourself about depression, about this illness. How is that by watching videos like these, for example, or by further informing yourself? There are many opportunities, many resources where you as a relative can educate yourself to understand your depressed family member, to recognize, oh, that's just a cliche, but it might not be true at all that one just cries all day or something like that. So try to be as understanding as possible and also recognize the depressive patterns in order not to reinforce them as an outsider. This is a very important point. Point 4 of the biggest mistakes, interfering in the therapy. This is not your therapy, but that of your depressed relative. That means, as I just mentioned, calling for the depressed person or making appointments or something like that is not acceptable. Or commenting on the therapeutic measures, no. Or perhaps even speaking negatively about them. If someone, let's say, has newfound enthusiasm because they think, yes, and I have found a new great one, what do I know, a naturopath or something like that, and I want to go there and I want to seek help there, then please don't approach it with your own judgmental patterns in your head and say something like another charlatan. They just want your money anyway. So please refrain from such comments and instead be happy that the depressed person has found new courage and let them go there, even if you have the feeling that it might pose a risk of being taken advantage of or something like that. Then that's just how it is. Most of the time it isn't like that. But even if it is, even if it's a charlatan, the depressed person needs to have this experience themselves. You have to let them have experiences and make their own decisions. This is very important because making your own decisions, like I want this and I'm going there now, is an absolutely important, healthy behavior pattern, where you can be glad if the depressed person has this pattern. So please reinforce that. Your task is to reinforce the healthy behavior patterns and ignore the unhealthy ones so that you don't reinforce them. Also, don't work against them. How can you? That's a depressive pattern. Not that either, but simply don't simply pay attention to it at all, just so as not to give any energy to the depressive and negative pattern. So, it's important for you to learn to endure that the depressed person goes their own way, no matter what you think about this path. It is not your job to somehow steer the therapeutic path because you think you are the only one who can still think clearly here. That's not the case. I've even heard from people, clients who told me that their relatives secretly disposed of their tablets because they believe the person shouldn't take any medication. That's not acceptable. That's not the case. It's intrusive. It's disrespectful. It's like as if the depressed person were a 3-year-old child from whom you have to take away the tablets so they don't play with them. That's how it feels then. As a depressed person, you don't have the right to treat someone like a toddler. You may feel the need to treat the person like a small child because that is how they seem to you. They might seem that way. Helpless or small, but that's only because they feel helpless and small. They aren't actually, in reality, they are an adult, they just don't know it yet. They need to learn it again. That's the point. So, you also don't have the right to send someone to a clinic. I often hear this from relatives, from clients who tell me, everyone tells me I should go to the clinic, but I don't want to go there at all. As a relative, no matter what you think about it, you do not have the right to send the depressed person to the clinic, to simply register them there, or conversely, to perhaps prevent them from going because you think, no, that's not good. They must decide that themselves. Very important. Okay. Point number 5. Preventing changes. This means for you as a relative, allow your depressed partner or relative to change. Because healing always also means change. And that can become uncomfortable or unfamiliar for a relative when they suddenly behave differently. So it might be that the depressed person becomes more self-confident, that he suddenly starts telling you his opinion, that he might also have outbursts of anger that you don't know from him. So such things can happen because they are part of the healing process. That is very important. Please allow it, even if it becomes more uncomfortable for you, because otherwise you hinder the healing process. If you immediately suppress it and say, "We are cutting you off with me," or something like that, just be aware that new behaviors need to be practiced. And it can happen that at the beginning you don't yet have this golden middle path, and that you might overshoot the mark during the first cautious attempts, also confidently expressing your opinion. And it might be that the person with depression then perhaps overshoots the mark and perhaps makes a remark where you think, "Oh, what is that?" If you keep in mind that this is completely normal and that it is part of the learning and change process, yes, if you know that, then you can handle it. And then do you have to immediately retaliate so that the person with depression feels small again and withdraws? Instead, see it as progress. They are making huge progress. They are taking a giant step towards healing and normality and a normal, healthy life. When they express their opinion, whether you like it or not, you should hold back a little. So don't keep the person small just because you're used to them always making themselves small. They don't need that anymore. Making oneself small is a depressive pattern that they need to learn to stop. So please allow that. That is very important. Even if it affects your ego, pay attention to yourself. Feel within yourself if it affects your ego. What happens when the depressive partner suddenly starts to become confident? Okay. Point 6, the biggest mistake. Always taking 100% consideration. That is not healthy. You are an independent person, and you should always ask yourself, who is the most important person in my life? That is you. It is not your depressive partner or relative. You have your own needs, you have your own boundaries, and if you don't respect them and always take consideration, then it might happen to you, as it statistically happens to 50% of all relatives, namely that they become ill themselves. You will notice that it is a very, very stressful and exhausting situation to live with a depressive person. That is already a test of endurance. To ensure that you don't eventually become completely worn out or otherwise reach your limit or become ill or develop physical illnesses, it is important that you take care of yourself. In case of doubt, you are your own priority. That is very important. And it's like with the flight attendant on the plane. At the beginning of every flight, the flight attendant explains what to do if the oxygen masks drop down in an emergency. Maybe you have flown before and paid attention to what they say. They always say, "Please put on your own mask first before attending to your seat neighbors." This has nothing to do with selfishness. Rather, it is very important that you ensure you remain stable so that you can continue to be a support, because if you fall apart, you are no longer a support for your relatives. Therefore, you are allowed to think of yourself and don't always have to be considerate. Point 7 is related to neglecting social contacts. If you want to go out in the evening and have fun, then do it. It is very important that you don't stay home all the time out of sheer solidarity. Just because the depressed partner can't go out or doesn't feel like it or doesn't have the energy or something like that, try to make compromises. Of course, you can stay home sometimes, but please not always. Do not neglect your social contacts. Your hobbies, your friends, everything that brings you joy indirectly helps your depressed partner because you remain stable. Always keep that in mind. Point 8 is somewhat related to this, namely constantly having a guilty conscience. Pay attention to how you feel inside when your depressed relative is not doing well. Or when they say, "Oh, can't you please stay home? I feel so alone," and you would like to go out. Then please stick to the fact that you are allowed to go out without feeling guilty. You don't have to feel guilty Sometimes people with depression have a behavior pattern that they don't even realize, and they don't mean it in a bad way, that they complain a little and feel a bit sorry for themselves and want to make you feel guilty and want to put pressure on you. They don't mean it in a bad way, but it sometimes just happens due to this depressive thinking and feeling. And if you know this and keep it in mind, then just lovingly make yourself aware of this pattern so you don't fall into the trap of being pressured or even manipulated. So, as I said, these are patterns that occur unconsciously in people with depression, not out of malice, but just pay a little attention to it. And by the way, you can also tap. Yes, so this tapping technique that I always teach to people with depression, it helps with everything. It also helps family members. You can tap away a guilty conscience and then you won't have it anymore. You can tap on all your feelings. Yes, it is a universal tool for everyone, which works for everyone. And if you want to learn it from me, feel free to get in touch. As a family member, you can also simply do my tapping session. You don't have to be sick or depressed for it. Okay, point 9, always playing the strong one. As I already mentioned at the beginning, if in a relationship one person is always the strong one and the other is always the weak one, that's an imbalance that is not healthy for the relationship in the long run. So make sure that the relationship remains on equal footing. And you achieve this by giving the depressed person the chance to be the strong one, in the sense that you also cry on their shoulder sometimes. Yes, so please don't make the mistake of thinking, oh, they already have enough worries, so I'll just swallow my problems to avoid burdening them. That's not the case. Or let's say it depends on what kind of problems they are. If you feel bad because of the depressed person, that's a topic you should discuss with someone else, because then they would feel terrible guilt. But if it's about, I don't know, problems at work or any conflicts with colleagues, with friends or something like that, where the depressed partner has nothing to do with it, cry on their shoulder, please, because that gives the depressed person the feeling of being strong for once and not always just the weak, sick one. And you are allowed to cry it out because you need that. You can't always be strong. No one in the world can do that. And you don't have to do that either. And please don't pretend to do that either, because it's a terrible feeling when you're always in the weak position. Okay. And we also have point 10. Namely, the biggest misunderstanding among relatives is still, I don't need help. After all, I'm not the sick one. I just mentioned that, yes, you may not be sick, but you need support. Absolutely, because it's simply an incredibly burdensome situation for relatives over a long period, and it lasts a long time. Living with someone with depression, who at the moment only drains your energy and can't give you any because they have none, that is incredibly exhausting. That's why please get help for yourself. You don't have to undergo a full psychotherapy for that. It's not possible because you would need a diagnosis for it to be covered by insurance. But there are options outside of psychotherapies. For example, there are freelance psychological counselors or alternative practitioners for psychotherapy. With them, you can treat yourself to 1 or 2 individual sessions to get advice on your specific situation. Or, for example, you can learn tapping with me. So I can gladly tell you a few things about your personal situation, and if you want support, feel free to contact me. There are also offers for clients. For example, sometimes there are informational evenings for relatives where the illness of depression is explained in detail, so that you as a relative know exactly what is happening there. How does the person feel? Then, for example, there is also the Federal Association of Relatives of the Mentally Ill. They publish wonderful brochures, informational brochures on various mental illnesses from the perspective of the relatives, which are really aimed at the relatives. There is even an emergency hotline, a counseling hotline, the so-called Telephone. They are based in Bonn, and look it up. Check the internet for the number if you really don't know what to do anymore. Sometimes you really reach your limit in such situations, then call them. It's basically something like a telephone counseling service. So these are volunteers who have been affected themselves or are still affected, and who take the time from their wealth of experience for you to tell you a few things and to tell you what worked for them. Try it out. They just listen to you. Yes, so just try it out and make it clear to yourself. Please don't be among the 50% who also get sick. It's not necessary. You just have to follow a few rules and make sure that you don't make the mistakes I just told you about. These are the 10 most important points for now. There might be more to say. Maybe I'll do that in another video, and pay attention to yourself to see if you notice signs of overload and then get help immediately. These can also be physical signs like a cold that lingers and lasts a bit longer, or back pain or headaches or anything that you experience more frequently and for longer than usual. Please pay attention to this and then get help immediately if anything like that occurs. Feel free to write in the comments what you think about it, or if you have any other tips to help others as well. You are also welcome to write in the guest book on my website at www.seelenklopfen.de. Under Success Recipes, you can write your tips on what has helped you to better cope with your depressed relative. Yes, okay. As I said, get in touch with me, and I wish you a wonderful day. All the best. Goodbye.